to a German secret society and was there to start a Yale chapter of the same society, Skull and Bones.
Speed up a couple of centuries, and this student-led posse becomes a feeder to one of the world's most powerful organizations.
In 2007, the movie The Good Shepherd comes out, and it really showcased the connection between the Skull and Bones and the CIA.
In the 1960s, 1970s, the bond was so tight that Bonesmen considered the CIA what they called an employer of last resort, meaning that if they couldn't get a job anywhere else, well, Skull and Bones men could always work for the CIA.
Just what is the true purpose of this mysterious Ivy League cabal? Some suggest Skull and Bones is after nothing less than world domination.
It is a very self-serving secret society. It only exists to put its own members into positions of power and then to have those members hire other members to positions of prominence. But as far as this shadow government, new world order pushing cult, no, that's really not what it is.
Just about every major U.S. politician who went to Yale was a part of Skull and Bones.
And they've all been sworn to secrecy. While little is known about their secret practices, a few tantalizing clues have emerged.
Skull and Bones owns an island called Deer Island. People assume it's sort of like a Playboy mansion with parties and hot women. It's not. It's actually more of a rundown rustic summer camp.
Skull and Bones gives its members a secret name that they use during their rituals and in the tomb. For instance, George Bush Sr.'s secret name was Magog, which, legend has it, refers to the student who had a lot of sexual experience. George Bush Jr. never picked a name for himself, so the name that was assigned for him, Temporary, ended up being his name the entire time that he was in Skull and Bones.
It all starts with tapping, an arcane selection process in which 15 elite students are invited to join each year.
You don't go and say, I want to join. Skull and Bones recruits.
Skull and Bones taps students whom they believe will reflect honor and wealth back on the society after graduation, whether it's student leaders or editor of the school paper, athletes, just people who have really distinguished themselves as someone who's going to be big in the future.
Once you're tapped, it's time for a truly strange initiation rite.
Apparently, they have potential members to lie in a coffin and masturbate while they scream out their sexual conquests.
Is called connubial bliss, or the sexual history. And there, they're supposed to recount their entire sexual history, presumably from the first masturbatory experience up to present day. I gotta tell you, I went to Yale. I know Yale men. I don't know how they lasted an entire evening talking about this stuff.
And it all happens in the tombs, where the Bonesmen are surrounded by buried treasure.
Yale secret societies pride themselves on what they call crooking, which is actually a really nice word for stealing. They like to go out into the world, steal items of importance, and then hide it in their tombs. Of all the items that are rumored to be in the Skull and Bones tomb, Geronimo's skull is the most plausible.
Once you've been given the keys to the tomb, you have to keep the biggest secret of all.
One of the rules in Skull and Bones is that if the name Skull and Bones is mentioned in the company of a member, that member has to leave the room immediately.
Journalist Ron Rosenbaum hears about this rule and decides he's going to spring a question about Skull and Bones to George Herbert Walker Bush, President of the United States, on Air Force One, figuring that the president can't leave the airplane.
The president gave a number of platitudes about the group and said, you know, we're really not too into talking about things like this.
But Rosenbaum notices that Barbara Bush, who was doing some knitting, was furiously clicking her knitting needles together, showing that she was a bit nervous about this subject. Maybe George should shut up.
What keeps us captivated with secret societies is the absence of information. It's not what we know about them that draws us in, but what we don't know.
Coming up, America's most notorious secret society, the Mafia.
One of the biggest aspects of secret cultures in general is that they're bonding over loyalty. You know, once you have these secret codes, you have a brotherhood.
What's really fascinating about secret societies are the way they hold the attention of people who aren't members.
People are intrigued by the secrets in secret societies. You want to know what they're not telling you. So the whole idea of a secret society is really alluring to people because it's like they know something you don't.
Skull and Bones, the Freemasons, the Illuminati. Their names conjure up images of secret handshakes and late-night rituals. But no shadowy organization commands our attention like the Mafia. Today, the mob has a virtual monopoly on our media. From hit TV series, to movies, to video games.
The Mafia essentially replaced the cowboy in American cinematic myth.
It's an era. Godfather, Sopranos, Goodfellas.
Books, films, television shows, reality television shows, video games, rap music, cell phone applications. The Mafia sells.
There's a whole code of life to the Mafia, and their loyalty to one another is what really fascinates us.
To keep its existence secret, the Mafia has one unbreakable rule, omerta, or the rule of silence.
Being willing to keep your mouth shut is an important facet of omerta, but omerta is a way of being. It's a way of carrying yourself that lets everyone know that you are not a man to be trifled with.
My mother used to tell me two things. Don't ever go after another man's woman. And the other thing is, don't squeal.
And omerta also means keeping a low profile.
In my old neighborhood, there was nobody walking around with fancy suits and ties. The boss was a guy who hung out in a fruit store with vegetable stains on his shoes and pants.
Flashback to the early 20th century, and the mob goes big time when it crosses the Atlantic for America.
They came to America, they moved into tremendously overcrowded, impoverished ghettos, Little Italy, East Harlem, all up and down the East Coast.
With that group of immigrants were mafia people, and they were very entrepreneurial. They weren't willing to be peasants for very long in the new country.
They went into these poverty neighborhoods and they took advantage of their own fellow Italians.
They would extort Italian businessmen. And while people often liked to see the Mafia as a protector, those notions of feudal chivalry dissipated, and the ruthless, parasitic nature of the Mafia came to the forefront.
Then, in 1919, the U.S. government hands these small-time criminals the greatest gift of all, Prohibition.
This was the big golden era of the Mafia.
The Mafia was involved in Prohibition by making sure it was able to smuggle alcoholic beverages from offshore and places like Canada into the United States.
All over the city of New York and all over the country, there were these private clubs, and they were run by the Mafia.
The mob was making tens of millions of dollars from bootlegging.
During this period, the big names of the Mafia became headlines. This is when you had Capone, and you had Bonanno, and you had Lucchese, and you had Lucky Luciano.
This golden age of the mob era captured our imagination in film and TV.
Prohibition really did two things for the Mafia. Prohibition gave them unlimited wealth and access to a society that they were excluded from prior to Prohibition.
But as mafiosi get a taste for the finer things, the rule of silence gets ignored, with disastrous results.
In 1957, there was a meeting in upstate New York. Hundreds of high-powered Mafia bosses from all across the country gathered to discuss Mafia protocol. Somehow that meeting got raided by federal law enforcement, outing the Mafia essentially to the American public.
And this was the first time those who watched it on the television news were convinced that there was a Mafia. Prior to that, there'd been some doubt.
Now all of America knows the Mafia exists, but we won't truly understand its reach until 1963. That's when one Joe Cargo Valachi pulls back the curtain in testimony before the U.S. Senate.
Before Joe Valachi, the Mafia was largely shrouded in secrecy. After Joe Valachi, the language of the Mafia became the language of every American.
He was a low-level person in the Bonanno family.
He was from our neighborhood, sad to say.
Valachi spilled his guts about the way the mob is organized, its hierarchy, and he also spilled some secrets about particular guys who had been around. So he was spilling a lot of secrets.
But our Mafia fixation begins with our first fly-on-the-wall view of mob life, courtesy of a 33-year-old director named Francis Ford Coppola.
When the film version of The Godfather was released in 1972, it was truly a cultural phenomenon. For the first time, the mafia was explored as a